Settling into our noble position. It's noble because of Ariya, the truths that's taught by the Aryan, the noble one, the Buddha. And it leads to a state, an enlightened state that's possible. And they're called the Four Noble Truths, the noble qualities, because they take courage and honesty and wisdom and profundity of character to see reality as it is. And so we take this time to honor, pay homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Buddham saranam gacchami, Dhanang saranam gacchami, Sanghang saranam gacchami, Dutiyampi Buddhang saranam gacchami, Dutiyampi Dhanang saranam gacchami, Dutiyampi Sanghang saranam gacchami, Tatiyampi Buddhang saranam gacchami, Tatiyampi Dhanang saranam gacchami, Tatiyampi Sanghang saranam gacchami. Paying homage 3 times to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. We have this container. We have this container of dana, generosity to ourselves for being here. And sila, acknowledging the precepts, acknowledging living in harmony, and the teachings, bhavana. And this gives us a sense of containment, a kind of safety together. While we sit and look at all the crazy shenanigans of the mind, all the wild places the heart carries us into, all the uncomfortable places that the body sometimes puts us in. Giving us direct experience to seeing the non-stable nature of conditioned things that are arising and passing away. By now you've chosen whatever way it is that you like to settle in this moment, whether it's through noticing the breath arising and falling or at the nostrils, or whether it's being aware of conditions coming into the body at one of the sense doors, or the predominant sensation that arises. Letting mindfulness be there, noticing if it's pleasant or unpleasant, or maybe we can't really tell. We can usually tell how we are led around by our desires and our aversions, and we can see it pretty clearly when we sit down. We may choose an intention. To be present with the breath or present in the moment. We may have an intention of having mindfulness be present as much as we can. We can use the object of our breath to keep our attention on, to really see the true nature of things, what's happening in our own experience. No one else can walk this path for us. But lucky for us, we do have the Dhamma taught by the Buddha, guiding us in some effort to walk on the path, enabling us to see and point out what we might need to understand, which he saw for himself, having abandoned his other teachers, where he was successful in their practice but never felt totally free. It's a path to liberation, to take place within ourselves. And the Dhamma isn't really meant to be approached as a neat system of ideas that's admired and discussed. It doesn't let us off with easy answers to ultimate questions. What it gives us is basic methods to a way to find answers for ourselves, to make our own discovery of truth through our own lives. And so rather than starting off with theoretical dogmas and beliefs, the Buddha's teaching begins with a simple observation. A very profound one, that's the gateway to all wisdom, really, that human life is essentially problematic, beset with problems and difficulties and inequities and what the Buddha called Dukkha, usually translated as suffering. And so we have this way shown to us to find out of our situation that's problematic and a way to attain inner freedom. True happiness. Which means we sit and pay attention to what arises. Some may be pleasant, some may be unpleasant. Maybe some we can't see very clearly. So the Buddha made suffering and the cessation of suffering as the focal point of his teachings. And he dealt with it in a realistic way, a way that we can verify within our own experience. What is rising? What is happening in the mind right now? What is happening in the body? What are we aware of? Even if it's pleasant or unpleasant, can we see it with mindfulness, knowing that it doesn't last, it's impermanent, and we can't hang on to it? And we just remind ourselves gently over and over again to return to the present moment, to see what's happening now. The Buddha used the example of the goldsmith being given a lump of metal and told it was gold. And it's not accepted through belief, but it's tested and examined. You burn and cut and scrape until the goldsmith is convinced that it's gold. And so the Buddha also said, accept my doctrine only after examining and scrutinizing it, not merely out of respect for me. The work is left up to us. Being present with what arises, noticing perhaps if it's skillful, letting it go if it isn't, and inclining our minds toward some of what we understand of effort and patience, faith, which the confidence in the practice, seeing that we can wake up in a moment when we notice that we might be attached to it, grasping it, or pushing it away. Just harnessing the mind to pay attention to a single object is a slow process. It can be the use of the breath or the touch point of the buttocks on the chair, where the hands are touching. It can also be constantly changing objects that are arising, but we attend to it. We see what comes to that sense door, the conditions that have come together. And we connect with it and sustain that connection until we see it flow away naturally on its own accord. And from this we might get glimpses of some cessation of suffering as we let go. when the mind wanders and we find ourselves lost somewhere and we don't know where, we can wake up in that moment. Be aware. We can investigate it a little bit. Is it pleasant or unpleasant? We can guide ourselves back to that kindness that we give ourselves for being present and applying a little energy to just begin again. Sometimes we find body sensations calling our attention. Sometimes we find emotional states calling our attention. Mindfulness is there to be present with what arises. Awareness is there. Wisdom can be present. We can investigate sometimes. What is this like? Knowing it, direct knowing, direct touching directly what's happening. Not a conversation about it to ourselves, but being present directly. Is there constriction in the mind sometimes? Or is something warm or cool or stabbing? Lots of adjectives around sensations that show themselves in the body. But sometimes we can find ourselves below the thought stream and just being with what arises and passes, arises and passes, arises and passes, mind moment after mind moment. we remind ourselves that doing this practice is not only beneficial to us, but it's beneficial to others. And we begin again with a gratitude, a gladdening, a joy, a small smile that this is hard work to try to be in the present and not fantasize about the future or go back over and over again about the past. But we can notice true moments of a different kind of unworldly happiness. A spaciousness, a letting go. We can let ourselves be in a kind of open awareness, sitting in our grounded position of the container of our breath in our bodies. Noticing the breath throughout the body. Noticing that silence between the breaths. And as we begin to bring this sitting period to a close, may we include ourselves in kindness. May we hold ourselves gently. May we have compassion when things are challenging for us. Remember patience. May we let this concentration and spaciousness that develops over our formal sitting time flow into a kind of concentration practice from our hearts and minds to embrace well-being. Still noticing the breath, still being present, and eliciting a feeling. Nurtured and encouraged by openness of our hearts. Sometimes we may notice they aren't very open. That's okay. Sometimes repeating what phrase works for you around the loving kindness practice can be a simple way to focus the heart and mind. May I be free. May I have ease in my life. May I let go of my inner suffering. May I be free from external harm. And these practices, surprisingly enough, when I think about not being really involved in it, I think about the monks that it was taught to and how they were sitting under trees and in huts, in forests, scared of various animals and even tree spirits and devas that didn't want them to be sitting there in their forest, taunting them, and the fear of snakes and all kinds of things living in a forest. And that the Buddha taught the Brahma Viharas, and particularly the metta practice, that they surround themselves, that they include within themselves, that they develop within themselves this sense of goodwill, this sense of kindness to themselves under dire circumstances, and to the others that were their difficult beings for them. And that it's loving kindness that is developed to open our hearts when things are fearful or full of grief or difficult. May we find that kindness, even if it's in brief moments. May we hold ourselves in kindness, in well-being. May we know that we are held by others whom we don't know. May I be free from suffering. May I have ease and well-being. May I take care of myself happily. Sometimes that might mean doing something I don't really want to do, but it's the right thing to do for taking care of myself. May these thoughts of kindness flow to others whomever you choose, a benefactor, a friend. Letting those phrases that you develop for yourself, or the feeling within your heart and mind, the visceral sensations, may they include another. May this kindness and compassion that we incline our hearts and minds to include another person. Whether it be a friend or a benefactor or a neutral person, someone that you don't know, but you see occasionally, don't have an opinion about. It could be a group of people. Letting this kindness pervade others. May you be free from harm, safe and protected. Just as I wish to be happy, I know that you also wish to be happy. May you be free from harm. Have ease in your life. Letting this heartfelt wish for others, including in our heart space, to go in other directions, right from where we're sitting to our neighbors. May they be free from harm, safe and protected. May their lives have ease. We may have some more difficult people in our neighbors, or in our family, or in our friends. May we let this kindness be able to touch upon them, knowing that they too wish to be happy. It's really a process of letting our hearts stay open to what might be adverse circumstances, like the monks in the forest, developing kindness for ourselves and others, compassion in others' difficulties, May we let this kindness and compassion include people in all directions, beings in all directions, human, animals, known and unknown, seen and unseen. Those that are realized and those that are in suffering, those on the path, above and below the earth and the waters. May all beings everywhere, may all beings everywhere have happiness, the causes of happiness. May we hold them in our hearts and in our minds. May this spaciousness of kindness and compassion be developed to allow us to stay open to what comes to us. Understanding that all sentient beings have suffering. Anicca vata sankhara upadavaya domino upakitava merchanti te samvapasamo sukho. All conditioned things are subject to impermanence. They arise and pass away. Seeing this clearly with mindfulness brings the greatest happiness, which is peace. Letting this place within our hearts flow to each other in our circle. Letting that kindness reach to each of you. Knowing that we have joys and sorrows subject to human existence, and that we develop this practice in ourselves so that we can try to see our own pathway out of suffering and include others in our kindness and compassion. We have the joy of being able to share it with each other on our own path together, which can nurture us and bring us sustenance, especially when we might be trying to offer it to others that are a little less easy to offer to. This whole idea of being, born into suffering, conditions come together and it causes suffering. And, we started a little bit last week and talked about the second truth, but I thought maybe I would back up and mention the Four Noble Truths. That right after the Buddha's enlightenment, he traveled to Deer Park, and he set in motion there, delivering his first discourse. And the subject was the Four Noble Truths. And it's pretty interesting that all of these numerous and diverse teachings of the Buddha fit together into a single unifying frame teaching the Four Noble Truths. He mentions that the footprints of all the legged animals are encompassed by the footprint of the elephant, and that the elephant's footprint is considered foremost among them in terms of size. And in the same way, all the skillful qualities that we need are gathered under the Four Noble Truths. You know, sometimes you hear the Four Noble Truths as being like the ABCs of Buddhism, kind of preparation for higher doctrines, or quote, you know, for the real thing. But this isn't really the right attitude. The Buddha said that as long as he had not clearly understood the Four Noble Truths, the contents of the truth and the functioning that needed to be accomplished and the fulfillment, you know, he broke things down into different aspects, and, you know, we've seen lots of lists, but he didn't proclaim in the world that he had achieved this supreme perfection, this enlightenment, this freedom, until he could really see clearly and understand the Four Noble Truths. And it's acknowledged that the Buddhas before him, that both formally and then, that what he taught was just suffering and the cessation of suffering. And in that first discourse, when he sets in motion this wheel of the Dhamma, he says, as long as I did not fully understand and penetrate the Four Noble Truths, I didn't claim in this world I had reached the supreme enlightenment. But when I fully penetrated the Four Noble Truths, then I could claim that I reached enlightenment. And he said that when a Buddha appears in the world, that there is a teaching of the Four Noble Truths. There were, I don't know how many Buddhas before him. There are various speculations, but I think it's sort of been traced back somehow that there were maybe at least 14 or something like that. And when you read about how often they come into human form and how many eons and universes of time happens between them, you know, and still, when a Buddha appears in the world, there's a teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And he said that this is like the rising of the sun. And, you know, the moon shedding great light over the world, which is why we're so privileged to be born human in this life, that we have the opportunity to still hear the teachings of the Buddha. There have been many long years in between when in various worlds, and people did not receive the teachings of a Buddha. And the Buddha says that as long as we remain blind to the Four Noble Truths, then we're sort of lost in ignorance. We roam around in samsara, another round of suffering. But when we awaken to the truths, and when we make them a living experience, that's the wisdom of enlightenment, and it leads to freedom and to a liberated mind. And so having these four truths become alive for us on a regular basis is really important and, I think, inspirational. And so that first one, the truth of dukkha, dukkha is usually translated as suffering, but the Pali word has a much deeper root to it. And the second truth, the truth of the origin of dukkha, that the Buddha identified as craving, thirst, or blind, self-centered desire. as the cause of suffering. And then the truth of the cessation of dukkha. So these are all about dukkha. The truth of the cessation of dukkha, the end of suffering. And that's what he identifies as nibbana, or the deathless state. And then there's the truth to that path, the way to liberation from dukkha, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. And so, as we can see, the Four Noble Truths center around this single theme or this subject of dukkha. And each one treats that theme from a different angle. The first truth lays out the problem, the forms of dukkha. The second truth traces the problem to its cause. The third solution gives us, the third one gives us a solution. And then the fourth one maps out the way to achieve the solution. He really treated it like a physician. And since the Four Noble Truths address the problem of dukkha, and our understanding of the Dhamma hinges on the way that we understand the word dukkha. The Pali word is often translated as suffering, pain, and misery. And these capture parts of its meaning. And they also kind of give rise, I think, to some misconceptions, due partially to the fact that there's no single English word that gives full justice to the Pali word. And it originally meant pain and suffering, and the Buddha sometimes uses it in a limited sense when he would speak about unpleasant feelings in the body and of the mind, and calls them dukkha vedana. That's pain-fulfilling. But he also took the word of common usage and elevated it to a lot wider and deeper meaning, where it really suggests a basic unsatisfactoriness, a pervading of all existence. So when we use the English word suffering, we need to understand that while it refers to felt pain and unhappiness and dissatisfaction, the Buddha is also using it in a deeper and broader sense. And the Pali word satya, or truth, the Four Noble Truths, the Pali word satya, truth, indicates that which is, rather than a true statement or a proposition, but it's that which is. It's the truth that's always present, but sometimes it's hidden from our sight due to this sort of screen of ignorance that we have. I notice my screen of ignorance popping up a lot, and I go, what's really happening? What's the truth of what is? Instead of all these ways that I'm trying to make something fit into the way I want it to be. That the first truth is the state of dukkha itself. The second truth is its actual cause, the craving. The third truth is its cessation, and the fourth is the path. And that Noble Eightfold Path, the fact that these are truths implies that they're not merely formulations that the Buddha made up, but they're, it's directly existence of reality, that which is. And they're called noble truths because they were taught by him, the noble one, the Buddha, and they lead to a state of being a noble one, an enlightened one. And then there's four of them, and that gives us everything we need for liberation. It's hard to believe. No other truth has to be added to it. And although I have heard some people now currently in this day and age, and I think Gil Fronsdale is one of them, who added, oh no, maybe it wasn't in the Four Noble Truths. It's a different list. But there are some people who go a little bit outside the boundaries of these four, and I'm trying to remember who it was, and I can't, so I'll let it go for now. But it's just basically we see that the Buddha looks at things like a physician. You know, this is what is, this is the cause of it, this is what can happen if you do these things. And, you know, the noble truth about dukkha, which we can find out directly, is that, you know, birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha, pain and grief and despair is dukkha. That there's dukkha when we're separated from the pleasant things, and there's dukkha when we are stuck with unpleasant things. And not to get what one wants is considered dukkha. And so, in short, the 5 aggregates of clinging is dukkha. And he explains the truth by listing various types of dukkha. And he goes over birth and aging, when it sets in, you know, our wrinkled skin and our teeth and various things. And sickness, whether it's physical or mental, is suffering. And at the end comes death and the breakup of the body and the extinguishing of the life force. And that is suffering also. And he also, looks like Doug is leaving us a little tiny bit early. Bye, Doug. And he also talks about the 5 terms that give a kind of overview of the vocabulary of suffering, that there's sorrow, there's lamentation, crying and weeping, there's pain that's bodily, and there's grief, any kind of mental unhappiness. Despair is the lowest point of mental anguish, when all hope is given up. And we can really see, you know, right now in these times, and I'm sure other people in other generations, things that were happening to them seemed just as overwhelming as things that we see, you know, happening to us, of deep grief, deep despair, deep lamentation, and deep sorrow. And, you know, this is like the way it is. This is the truth. This is the way it is. And if we can really see for ourselves the suffering that happens in grasping and clinging, you know, we can start to see in our lives how the 4 Noble Truths apply. And as we already did and we'll do over and over again, the Eightfold Path, we can see that there is a way to envelop these teachings that allows us to be with the pain and the grief and the suffering happening that we see around us or experience within us. And yet there's an upliftment in understanding that by living, you know, by having right livelihood and right intention, right action, right speech, by living within the teachings of the Buddha and the Eightfold Path, the more we really embrace it for ourselves, we find this truth in suffering and have a kind of equanimity that we can have for ourselves, as well as for all those who are in so much suffering right now, all of those who have been in so much suffering for eons of time and generations. And, you know, dukkha kind of points to this gap between this ideal state of permanent happiness that we seem to want to have and the sort of stumps and thorns and, you know, the living experience that throws us off. Margaret. Oh, wait, I have to turn my speaker back on.